Hello, my name is Chris Herb from Self-Help Training, and in this short video I'd like to introduce you to 7 dimensions that you can use to analyze your intercultural communication. That is to say, you can determine what are your own cultural preferences, what is your own cultural mindset, and what is the cultural mindset or what are the cultural preferences in terms of these dimensions of the people that you're communicating with. Before we start talking about these intercultural dimensions, I'd just like to talk a little bit about culture in general. So, what is culture? One simple definition of culture that I like is that culture is a collective programming of the mind. So we're programmed a certain way, but we're not necessarily conscious of the way we've been programmed. It works a little bit to explain it along the lines of a fish in the aquarium. A fish in the aquarium swims in the water. Water is the culture. We're not really thinking about our culture. We're not really conscious of our culture. It's only when we come into contact with people from other cultures, that is to say, when we go from one fishbowl to another fishbowl, that we start becoming aware of the differences between cultures. Another important point is that there are many different levels of culture. We can look at culture at the level of civilizations, where, for example, we could say there's the Western European culture to which the United States belongs and Australia. We could look at Latin America, we could look at Sub-Saharan Africa, we could look at the Middle East and North Africa, and so on. So we could look at culture at the level of civilizations. Or we could look at culture at the level of regions. We could say, talk about Scandinavia, that share a common history and a common culture in many ways. We could look at North Africa. We could look at Southern Africa, and so on. The next level is at the national level, so where we could talk about Germany, we could talk about the United States. Then, often we have minorities within a particular culture. We have regional differences. We could go a step further and we could talk about organizational culture. So there are many different levels of culture. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the national culture, but in principle we can also use these dimensions to analyze differences within a national culture, and we can use it for any of the levels. Finally, we should also remember that there is more diversity within a particular national culture than there is on average between national cultures. So national cultures are very rich and very diverse, and we don't want to fall into the trap of stereotyping. Stereotyping is when we say that because somebody comes from a certain area, they are a certain way. So, for example, all Germans drink beer, or all French people drink wine. That would be a stereotype. It doesn't apply to 100% of the population. And when we talk about these cultural preferences, there is, of course, a lot of variation within national cultures and also due to the personality differences. So we're always talking about generalizations. A good generalization holds true for maybe 60, 70, certainly not more than 80% of the population. And there will always be exceptions to that. So it never holds true for anyone. We should keep that in mind as we start talking about some of these dimensions of intercultural differences. So let us begin with the first dimension, which is communication. Ultimately, it's all about communication. And communication is such a wide area that we can actually break it down into 4 distinct elements. So the first element that I would like to begin with is formality. We have cultures that are formal and we have cultures that are informal. What does it mean? Cultures that are formal have a lot of rituals, have a lot of protocol, and there are many different ways of addressing someone. Take, for example, Thailand, which is quite formal. In Thailand, you would address your uncle differently, depending on if it is your father's brother or your mother's brother. If your uncle is older than your father or younger than your father, older than your mother or younger than your mother, you would have different forms of addressing this person for each and every situation. In Thailand, there are more than 25 different ways of addressing someone. On the other hand, we have cultures that are informal. The most informal culture in the world is Australia. There is no formal or informal you, it's just you. In English, we used to have a formal and an informal you in the past, you or thou, but we no longer use it. Now, it's just one. In most other European languages, there's a formal and an informal you. In Spanish, for example, tú and usted. Tú is informal, usted is formal. And we see the same in French, in Italian, and so on. Now, another culture that is becoming, I think there is a trend for cultures generally to become more informal, and we see this trend reflected in some European languages, such as, for example, Swedish. In Swedish, most people today only use the informal you, which is du in Swedish. It sounds strange to someone in Swedish to hear the formal you. So Sweden is another country that tends to be much more informal. And as I said, we can see that there is a bit of a trend, a global trend for countries to go from formal to informal. Sometimes we also see divisions between generations within a country. Let's go on to the next element of communication. The second element of communication is expressiveness. There are cultures that are expressive, and there are cultures that are considered to be instrumental. In instrumental cultures, people control their feelings. In instrumental cultures, self-control is very important. These are the assumptions behind people behaving a certain way. On the other hand, in expressive cultures, it's considered desirable to show your feelings. This makes you authentic as a person. So what is an example of an expressive culture? An expressive culture, for example, would be Italy. Italians like to show their feelings. When they're happy, they would show their feelings. When they're sad, they wouldn't necessarily hold back. In Japan, on the other hand, which is an instrumental culture, people like to control their feelings. You maintain a poker face as far as possible. And this is done because of self-control. In Japan, self-control is considered to be very important. Now, we see also that when it comes to these intercultural dimensions, it's a little bit like these Russian babushkas. So you go, you've got one level, next level, next level, next level. You know, these Russian dolls. So you've got one, next level, next level. Actually here, we're interlocking with some other dimensions, namely masculinity and femininity. What may have also influenced the Japanese culture is that it is a very masculine culture. And in this culture, men in particular are not encouraged to show their feelings. Let's move on to the third element of communication. The third element of the dimension of communication is context. Some cultures are considered to be high context, and other cultures are considered to be low context. What does it mean? In a high context culture, your communication with another person is influenced by the context. So your relationship with one another, where you're communicating, and so on and so on. In a low context culture, you communicate predominantly through the words and not through the context. Let me give you some examples. China is a high context culture. Why? Because in China, the most important thing is interpersonal harmony. You want to have a harmonious relationship with other people. And so for that reason also, face is very important. You want other people to be able to maintain face. Let's look at how this could play out in practice. Say, for example, that you may be invited for dinner in China. you like the food, and you'd like to have another serving. In a low context culture, such as Germany, you'd say, can I have another serving? In a high context culture, such as China, you wouldn't say, can I have another serving? You would communicate through the context. In this case, the context would be the empty plate. By eating everything on your plate, you're signaling to your host, hey, I'd like some more food. Now, if your host doesn't notice that you've eaten everything on your plate, you might look at the plate, direct their attention to the plate, or say, hey, that was really yummy. And then through the context, they would understand you want another serving. It would be considered impolite to ask for another serving because that could be taken to imply that your host ignored his or her duties to take good care of you. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got low context cultures, such as, for example, Germany. In Germany, communication is predominantly conducted in words. The truth is considered to be more important than interpersonal harmony. Let me give you another example. There was a best-selling book in Japan called 101 Ways of Saying No. Because in Japan, which is high context, you don't want to say no to someone because that's considered impolite. Now, this book, 101 Ways of Saying No, was published in many countries, but it was not published in Germany. Why wasn't it published in Germany? Because it wouldn't sell. Imagine somebody in Germany went to a store and they saw a book, 101 Ways of Saying No. What? What's this? 101 Ways of Saying No? Then you can do this quite simply. No, or if it should be more polite, no thanks. Nobody in Germany, or most people in Germany rather, to use a generalization, would not buy a book like this. The next element of the dimension of communication is our approach to conflict. This actually largely overlaps with high context and low context. So low context cultures take a more direct approach to conflict, and high context cultures take a less direct, a more indirect approach to conflict, but it doesn't correspond 100%. Let me give you some examples. So in an indirect culture, you don't want to approach the conflict directly. In my experience, I've taught a lot of Chinese people, and one activity that I like to do is I like to ask people, what would you do if your neighbor plays loud music and you had an important assignment on the following day and you had to prepare for this assignment? What would you do to communicate to them, please turn down the volume? Most of the Chinese people that I worked with said that they would take one of the following approaches. They would write something on a piece of paper along the lines of, please turn down the volume. Then they'd go to the person's door, they'd slip it under the door, they'd knock on the door, or they'd ring the doorbell, and they'd run away. Others, again, would ring the doorbell, but they would go up the staircase so that the other person couldn't see them, and they would shout, turn down the volume! One person that I had said that he would go actually knocking on the door, which was unusual. He said that he would go knocking on the door and he would then ask the person, sorry, I have an important assignment tomorrow that I have to prepare for and it's a bit loud. Do you have something to put in one's ears? In the United States, on the other hand, which takes a direct approach to conflict, you would just go knocking on somebody's door and you'd ask the person, hey, sorry, it's a bit late and I need to get up very early. Would you mind turning down the volume? Or you could be even more direct. Please turn down the volume. I need to prepare for an urgent assignment tomorrow. You get the idea. Let's come to the second dimension, which is space. We can actually divide space into two distinct elements. First of all, there is the communicative space, and secondly, there is the physical space. Let's begin with the communicative space. I'd like to show you a simple model. Each one of us has three zones. We've got a private zone, we've got a personal zone, and we've got a public zone. Now, the private zone are the things that we keep to ourselves, that we don't necessarily discuss with everyone. Things that are considered to be private, depending on one's culture, may be, for example, my health, or my financial status, or possible problems that I'm having with my partner. But depending on your culture, it may also be your age, or your politics, your religion, and so on. Then we have the personal space. The personal space is the area where I talk about my preferences, I talk about my feelings, without necessarily disclosing the things that are really private. And finally, we have our public area, which I call the blah blah zone. In the blah blah zone, we're talking, but we're not really disclosing anything about ourselves. How you doing? Fine, and you? Everything's okay. But there is no real disclosure of personal emotions or feelings. So we can say that when it comes to private, public, and personal zones, there are differences between cultures. Let me show you an example of an American. Americans have a wide public zone. What does it mean? Americans are easy to communicate with. It's quite customary in the store for somebody to ask you, how you doing? And the only answer they expect is, fine, and you? So people have this wide public zone, but they have a smaller personal zone and they have a smaller private zone. People don't necessarily disclose everything about themselves to people that they know. They might spend time with one another, but they don't necessarily self-disclose. Now let me show you an example of a German. Germans have a small public zone. What does it mean? In Germany, for example, small talk is something that people struggle with. Germans would tell me, what small talk? How do you do small talk? Because it's not part of the culture. Germans are not comfortable going somewhere and just talking without really disclosing something about their emotions. Whereas, on the other hand, Americans would say, why should I self-disclose much about myself? Do people really care? So we see Germans have a small public zone, and they have a bigger personal area and a bigger private area. And actually, there is a separation between that private and that public area that in the past was communicated through the formal and the informal you. So in Germany, when you'd approach somebody and you would use the informal you, du, for the older generation, that meant now we could talk about everything. And if you were on formal terms with someone, then it was not expected for you to disclose your private emotions or your private thoughts or feelings to that other person. But that has changed with the younger generation. Nonetheless, Germans, regardless of whether they're younger or older, have in general a small public zone. So we could actually liken people to fruit, to use an analogy. Germans are like coconuts. They've got a hard shell, small public zone, hard from the outside, but when they open up, they will disclose. Americans, on the other hand, are more like peaches. It's easy to communicate with them, it's an informal culture, but they may not necessarily disclose their private emotions or feelings. And in addition to the peaches and the coconuts, we've also got the watermelons. Now, in a watermelon type culture, you don't really know where you're at with the other person. So there is a shell, but once you're inside, you don't really know whether you're in the private or the public area. Why might that be? It is because of context. In a high context culture, people don't necessarily say no. So they might listen to you, but they might not necessarily disclose their real emotions. So we've got peaches, for example, in the United States or in Australia. We've got coconuts, Germans, Central Europeans, also Russians would tend to be more coconutty. And then we've got watermelons, such as, for example, in Asia, in China, in Vietnam, and in some other countries. So, space, we can talk about communicative space. But in addition to communicative space, we've also got the physical space. And now the physical space has to do with our personal space. It has to do, for example, with my house, my apartment, and the different rooms in my apartment, my living room, my bedroom. Is this my private space? In most cultures, the bedroom is private. But in the United States, for example, your home is not as private as it is in many other cultures. You would readily invite people into your home, and they would enter your living room. On the other hand, we have cultures that are more private, such as, for example, Scandinavia or Central Europe. You wouldn't customarily invite somebody that you don't really know that well to your home because your home is more private and not semi-public. And in addition to our homes and our physical space, there also is our space when we communicate with one another. How much personal distance do we maintain? In Africa, for example, people don't maintain a wide physical distance. Typically, your personal space is only 60 or 70 centimeters. But then we have cultures such as, for example, Germany, where it is 1 meter 20. And this can give rise to all kinds of misunderstandings, such as, for example, when somebody from Africa first comes to Germany, and this person may ask someone for directions. Hey, I want to know how I can get to this or to this particular place. And they would come up to somebody in Germany, and the person right away would be jumping back. Why? Because in Africa, people don't have a very wide space. But in Germany, if you're approaching someone and you're 70 or 80 centimeters away from them, you've entered their private or their personal space, and they would move right away from you.